we're going to be talking about the bones of the wrist and the hand. We're looking at the palmar surface of a right hand and wrist. The way that you can tell that you're looking at a palmar surface, there are two main ways. First, looking at the phalanges, or the more distal of the bones. The surfaces are going to be flat, or sometimes there's a shallow groove on the palmar side as opposed to the dorsal side, which is going to be a bit more rounded and more bulbous. Also, you can tell that you're looking at an anterior or palmar view when looking at the carpal bones, because your pisiform will be sitting on top of your triquetrum anteriorly. Okay, we're going to start off with the carpal bones. There are two main rows of carpal bones. You're going to have your proximal and your distal rows. Both are composed of 4 bones. The proximal row is going to articulate with the radius, other than the pisiform, which we'll talk about in a moment. This proximal row does not articulate with the ulna. There's an articular disc in between. The distal row, also composed of 4 bones, are going to articulate with the 5 metacarpals. So we're going to start with the proximal row. We'll start with the most lateral, which is your scaphoid. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as the scaphoid bone. You know that you're looking laterally because the first digit, or the thumb, or the bones associated with that, are going to be much wider. So the scaphoid is going to be the most lateral of the proximal row. It articulates with the radius. It's going to be located in the floor of your anatomical snuff box. And this is a very clinically important carpal bone. It is the most frequently fractured of the carpal bones. And generally it will occur in this narrow region right here. These fractures are often misdiagnosed as severely sprained wrists. It's often hard to see the scaphoid in radiographs, and generally individuals will come back for second radiographs 10 to 14 days after the fracture has occurred, and the bone resorption or bone necrosis will be evident. And this is owing to the poor blood supply in this region. Okay, next to it, so more medial, you will have the lunate. The lunate is crescent-shaped, particularly in section. This also articulates with the radius, and this is the most commonly dislocated carpal bone. Generally, dislocation will occur when you fall on an extended wrist. This can also compress your median nerve. Okay, the most medial of the proximal row is your triquetrum. This is also part of that radiocarpal joint, so also articulating with radius. And sitting on top of it is the pisiform. The pisiform is an example of a sesamoid bone, and it's going to form within the tendon of your flexor carpi ulnaris muscle. Okay, moving on to the distal row of carpals, you will have your trapezium, which is going to be the most lateral. It articulates with the first metacarpal, and this is one of the most commonly given examples of a saddle synovial joint. Next to it is the trapezoid bone. It's named for its shape. Then you're going to have the capitate. The capitate is the largest carpal bone. It's named for its rounded head. And oftentimes forces generated by the hand, as during punching, are going to be transmitted through this third metacarpal, through the capitate, to the lunate or scaphoid, to the radius. The most medial of the distal row of carpals is the hamate, which is distinctive with this hook right here that's going to project anteriorly. Okay, now moving on to the metacarpals. There are 5 metacarpals. The most lateral of the metacarpals is referred to as your first metacarpal, second, third, fourth, fifth. So the first metacarpal is by far the thickest. The joint that's formed by the trapezium and the first metacarpal is significantly more independent than what you have in the joints in this region. All metacarpals are going to have three main portions. You're going to have the base, which is articulating with the distal row of carpals. So these are the bases. You'll have the body, which are the shafts, and the head. The heads are going to articulate with the proximal phalanges. A site of frequent fracture in terms of the metacarpals is with the fifth metacarpal. This is colloquially referred to as a boxer's fracture. This happens when someone punches with a closed abducted fist. Moving on to the phalanges, or the phalanx, meaning line of soldiers. Most digits are going to have three sets of phalanges. You'll have your proximal, which are articulating with the metacarpals, middle, sometimes referred to as intermediate, and distal, which are very distinctly shaped. One thing you'll notice when looking at the first digit is that there is only a proximal and a distal phalange. So there's no middle or intermediate phalange associated with the first digit. That's why you have 14 phalanges instead of 15. Similar to what you have in the metacarpals, you're going to have a base, a body, and a head. In terms of fractures of the phalanges, the distal phalanges are the most frequently fractured. Oftentimes this can occur with fingers getting caught in a door, and these are extremely painful injuries because the tips of the fingers are very highly developed in terms of sensory innervation.